Now, her work has turned to the subject of her talk tonight, which is displaying the self in early modern Iran, or early modern Isfahan, in fact. In this work that she's been doing, she's been looking at letters and how these letters elucidate the relationships between people, their friendships, their other emotional ties. And she really is one of the few people I know who can not only do this kind of work, but also just brings it alive for anyone who reads or hears her words. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Kathryn and thank you all for coming out in the storm, not too much of a storm, but anyway, to hear her tonight. Thanks.
Good evening, and thank you, Sheila, first for this very generous introduction. Yeah, I'm too short. Okay. As well as for the invitation. It's really an honor for me to be here. And thank you also to the audience who has come out here on a not so pretty Friday evening. Let me start off by saying that there's a slight change in the title. It's the emerging self/friend. As we'll see in the course of my talk, there's a real intimate relationship between the self and the friend that I'm trying to tease out and work with. This lecture is part of my current research on the unfolding of early modern subjectivities through cultural and social practices such as friendship, reading, writing, painting, and collecting. It is a work in progress, so it has much room to grow and will certainly benefit from your comments and critiques. Let me start with a quotation. "This gift, my friend, to thee I send, in hope to be approved. I have done my best, I do protest, for one so beloved." Mary Sharp to Mary Limmer, June 25th, 1790. What these lines lack in poetic elegance, they made good in sheer effort. Cross-stitch by cross-stitch, Mary Sharp had embroidered her message to a friend on a small piece of cotton. Samplers such as this one from the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, England, are powerful reminders that the history of friendship has barely become legible. It is to be found, among other things, in the folds of materials and everyday practices of gift-giving, histories that still need to be stitched together and integrated into the larger fabric of historical narratives. I offer my lecture today as a tribute to Annemarie Schimmel, whose life work on Sufi poetry illuminated the intimate relationship between God and the beloved, the friend and the lover, Asher Ma'shur Yor Rafiq Waliullah. Mind you, I have not embroidered my computer nor my paper. Nevertheless, I hope that the little stitches I deal out as part of this academic ritual will begin to weave together the histories of friendship and that of Sufism and literacy in early modern Isfahan. To bring to light the experiential, social, political, and material history of friendship, I have turned to the various textualities and mediations of friendship practiced during a new era and culture of collecting and literacy, both visual and literary, in early modern Isfahan. Writing, reading, reciting, and collecting poetry, letters, and paintings were the very spaces where the subject produced himself or herself, often figured as an extension of the friend. Today, I would like to provide you with a sustained glimpse of how practices of reading and collecting poetry, portraiture, and friendship letters drew on epistemologies of Sufism to shape and exhibit a distinct sense of the self. My lecture has three parts. I will begin by delineating the significant features of the early modern period, 15th to 18th centuries, that gave rise to literacy, collecting, and a keen sense of both history and the self. Then I will move to the sociological proliferation of poetry and painting. I will end by addressing the social contours of friendship shaped by a ubiquitous culture of Sufism to provide you with the textuality of friendship through examples of material exchanges between friends, namely through poetry, portraits, and letters. Part 1. During the 14th and 15th centuries, the lands of Iran, Mesopotamia, and Asia Minor experienced a period of decentralization upon the dissipation of Mongol or Ilkhanid governance. Millenarian movements raised their banners in the name of Ali, the Prophet Muhammad's paternal cousin and son-in-law, and attempted to gain regional control of the entire Iranian plateau. They formed a territorial circle around the central deserts amidst the inhabitable regions of the Iranian plateau and challenged the authority of Mongol successor states and Turkic confederations which were vying for regional domination. This was an apocalyptic time when people truly believed in the world's imminent end and in the imminence of the Messiah with his message of justice from the northern central Caspian Sea regions of Mazandaran all the way to the east in the regions of Khorasan and into the southwest regions of Iraq Arab. Messiahs claiming descent from Ali emerged from Sufi mystical circles and vowed to effect social and divine justice on earth. It was in these settings that Muslim rulers came to express their sovereignty and embody their sacrality in the manner of Sufi saints and holy saviors. Monarchs like Shah Ismail, the founder of the Safavi Empire, and Akbar, the Mughal ruler, modeled their courts on patterns of Sufi cults and fashioned themselves as the promised Messiah. In effect, they embraced a style of sovereignty that was saintly and messianic. Here you have an example from the Volnome, the Book of Divination, around middle of the 16th century, where you see clearly this figure with a halo, as well as the sleeves that are extended over the hands, which is a typical sign of a Sufi and of humility, but really in a very courtly setting as well. So the saintly and the Messiah, this similarity was neither coincidental nor a passing curiosity. Rather, it resulted from a common pattern of monarchy based upon Sufi and millennial motifs. This milieu saw the development of an ensemble of rituals and knowledges designed to make the body of the Muslim king sacred. Such cultural practices were widely used to cast the sovereign's image in the form of a prophesied savior, a figure who would set right the unbearable order of things and inaugurate a new era of peace and justice, the new millennium. Undergirded by messianic conceptions and rationalized by political astrology, this style of sovereignty served to bind courtiers and soldiers to the monarch as both spiritual guide and material lord. This millenarian craze provoked an acute sense of historical consciousness for both individual and sovereign positioning within cosmic and world history. The significance and meaning-making of one such apocalyptic moment generated a creative energy and an artistic brilliance sustained in part through court patronage that saw the production of dazzling works of art like the Volnome, this Book of Divination, which this is from. I'll just give you another sample here of the Miraj, the ascension of the Prophet Muhammad on his horse, giving out a ring to the lion, who is Asadullah al-Ghalib, who is Ali in fact, and here probably Ali's sword. The cultural dynamism of the period was not limited to the visual arts. Literary competence became the fundamental sign of culture and breeding in the courts and urban society as a whole. A mastery of the poetic tradition and a new cosmopolitan spirit of experimentation led to innovations in theme and genre. Previously, minor themes were brought into the standard poetic repertoire, leading to the formation of new genres such as the Sari-name, the cupbearer's song, where the apocalypse was central to the mood and poetics of the poem itself. I'll give you an example, a tasting from Muhammad Sufi Mazandarani, who dies around 1626. The world in this age of ours is like a body with no head, or a house with no owner. Neither good nor evil are in their proper place. Hats worn on the feet and shoes on the head. Nothing is what it's supposed to be, it seems. Noble and commoner find nature transformed. Male and female abhor one another, like fish in the meadow, like donkeys in the sea. Give wine, Sari, on this apocalypse, for it is a season of tumult, an age of conflict. Bede bade, Sari, در این رستاخیز که هنگام شور است و وقت ستیز. Part 2. Literacy and collecting. Changes in artistic practices and the spread of literacy had no doubt something to do with the apocalyptic ambiance of the age, but the political economy had so much to do with its sustenance. The diffusion of power in the Iranian land under the Timurid household gave rise to princely courts in Tabriz, I'm looking here, where is, in Tabriz and Isfahan, of course, yes, in Qazvin as well, and as well in Shiraz, an important center for both the grandsons of Timur, Iskandar Sultan and Ibrahim Sultan, patrons of the arts, in Yazd as well, and in Herat, which is not on this map, someplace around here, and became dynamic centers of local patronage. At this millenarium junction, claims to universal sovereignty were critical to Timurid patrons commissioning compendiums and genealogies of knowledge, from history to letters to astronomy to astrology to painting, calligraphy, and poetry. These collections created a new kind of a book, an anthology, a majmu'a in the Arabic roots, jama, to collect, or a muraqqa as far as paintings are concerned, from raqa'a, to patch together. But it also created a new sense of embodied knowledge that came to shape the early modern subject. And I'm using the early modern really not in terms of a teleology or a linear progression to the modern, but rather that the very emergence of a modern subject, I argue, was predicated on a prior sense of oneself, achieved through cultural practices such as collecting, writing, and circulating of letters that really developed a self-awareness and a certain kind of an interiority. Though anthologies or majmu'as of poetry and insha did exist before the Timurid period, before the 14th, 15th century, the practice of collecting painting and drawings for the purpose of album making in this majmu'a and muraqqa form can be traced to these Timurid courts. We have no extant collections of painting albums before the 15th century. One of the earliest anthologies was produced, in fact, in Isfahan, which I'll be talking about, and very deliberately dated Tuesday evening, the 21st of June, 1431, Isfahan, along with the name of the owner, Iskandar Sultan, the grandson of Tamerlane Timur, the governor of Fars. The new habit of assembling, as David Roxburgh puts it in his brilliant work on the Persian album, came to be shaped by and to shape the simultaneous pleasures of seeing, of reading, of learning. Roxburgh understands the collection and proliferation of painting albums as cultural repositories of former artworks that produced sites of memory. The ritual of compiling, the impulse to make collections through anthologies heightened an awareness of history, such that a history of Persianate art is made manifest for the first time through the act of mobilizing past drawings and paintings, reflecting upon them, and writing a preface to elucidate the vision of the painter who created the album. Albums also performed a didactic function, to teach past traditions of drawing and painting to a new generation of artists, as in this collage of Timurid album assembled in Central Asia sometime between 1400 and 1450s. The large format of the anthology itself suggests its utility to be viewed and appreciated by a private audience consisting of the master and his disciples who could congregate around it. Even though mastering the designs and techniques entailed an inscription of the technical knowledge by the apprentice painter or drafter, Roxburgh points out that the student did not merely imitate the drawings of past masters. One thing that you see in the historiography of this period is that there's a sense that both in poetry and in painting, there is an imitation, a blind imitation of past traditions, past styles, with no sense of a personal insertion into the painting or the poetry, and something that Roxburgh rejects, but Paul Lozinski also does it in the field of poetry. Instead, once the apprentice mastered the tradition, he was to add his personal touch as he composed his own work of art to display his refinement and his departure from the model. In this process of training, painters developed a keen sense of self as they drew on the genealogies of masters' expertise, adding their own literary and visual interpretations of key scenes, say from epics commonly illustrated like Ferdowsi's Shahnameh. The advent of portraiture and artists' self-portraits are testimonies to an emerging self-awareness in early modern Iran. Self-portraits of artists appear in concert with the writing of the self through poetry and prose. We have examples from the courtly circles of Shah Ismail, the founder of the Safavid dynasty, who writes his own book of poetry, his own divan. His son, Shah Tahmasp, writes a memoir in prose. Babur, the founder of the Mughal empire, also writes his own, what one can be called an autobiography, his route to the conquest of Hindustan. All these were vehicles through which their subjectivities were constituted and displayed. Let's take a look at the self-portrait of the artist Mir Mosaffar around 1530, who worked on the famous Shahnameh of Shah Tahmasp. Representing himself bent over by age and the meticulous labor of his craft that left him with weak eyesight, Mir Mosaffar gives voice to himself through the intermediary of a letter, a former petition, written out clearly so as to ensure its legibility for the recipient. Allah the Almighty, He, this longtime servant Mir Mosaffar, has a request. Given that for a while this son of a slave has been in your service, I am hopeful that he, Shah Tahmasp, will not refuse and will not be so inclined, and will be, so inclined. This humble one wishes that he could arrive at the royal service of His Majesty very soon. May the shadow of God be blessed. Mir Mosaffar positions himself curled over his petition to display his age, his humility, and his loyal service at the court of the king, Shah Tahmasp. His written words, penned on a scroll of paper, mediate between the painter and his absent patron, between slave and master, as though he is reading the content of his petition aloud. Mir Mosawwar represents himself through a common trope of Sufi poetry as the desiring self who comes to life in the absence of the beloved, yearning for union. Moreover, the artist captures for us critical practices necessary for the production of the self, that is, the very act of composing, writing and painting and reading. We will return to this point of the self unfolding in a portrait, a letter, or a lyric poem, a ghazal. But let us go back for a moment to the painting albums produced in the 15th and 16th centuries at the Timurid and Safavid courts to further explore the relationship between text, visual, and literary, assembled and circulated through albums to tease out the context in which they were performed and help us place literacy in a social setting. These 3 pages are from calligraphy and poetry albums signed by the calligrapher Mir Ali around 1520 and the other one in 1550. They exhibit the relationship between the writing on a page of mystical love poetry, as you have here, the paper itself, and the context in which poetry is performed between 2 male figures. And here I'm referring to them as male figures because their ideal types very different from the kind of portraiture that we saw with Mir Mosawwar. These 3 pages, let's take a closer look. The page of lyric poetry is composed in the form of a jung or a safine. It's a particular long-shaped manuscript which refers to the safine in Arabic as the boat. The jung is a Chinese word for the boat as well. And the shape of a portable book of poetry, often sized so that the traveler, recorder of anthologies of poetry, could tuck it in his belt comfortably. The image on the right depicts one male figure holding such a book of poetry that ignites a connection between the two. The hand gesture of the male figure on the left signals his receiving a gift of the book from his companion. It is not until we read the poem on the top right-hand side of the image, which in itself is a segment from the poetry book, that the meaning of the exchange becomes clear. The lines of poetry read, "Do yar zirak az bade kohan dusti, firaqi o kitabi o gushe chamani." 2 clever friends drinking from the aged jug of friendship, a delightful moment, a book, and a secluded grassy spot. This image is a representation of the ritual performance of lyric poetry. It is in a secluded space, complete with the accoutrements of mystical union, a garden in full bloom, a book of poetry, a jug and cup of wine, through which 2 old friends experience the pleasures of intimacy and conversation, suhbat. Here, the value and significance of paper is announced explicitly. There is no paper better than the Chinese. No matter what you may sample, there is no better. It kind of reads like a modern ad. Paper is understood as the technology through which friendship is developed between the lover and the beloved, the very medium through which intersubjective discursive practices such as letter writing, reading, and conversation between friends are made possible. The sociological growth of poetry and painting began in the Timurid period, continued unabated in the following 2 centuries of Safavid rule in the 16th and 17th centuries. With the expansion of patronage networks for the arts beyond court circles, bakers, locksmiths, barbers, launderers, paper sellers became poets of great repute. Wealthy merchants would act as patrons or performers at literary salons, which flourished in major urban centers like Isfahan. This new popularity of poetry and, among craftsmen and shopkeepers were matched with a widespread and burgeoning enthusiasm for writing verse across all levels of court society. Professional poets, conversely, were often noted for their competence in other forms of art, like painting. The popularity of painting, too, led to another transformation in the artistic practices that overshadowed manuscript illustrations. Single-page paintings, as Masume Farhad has persuasively shown, as well as the work of Sheila, commissioned by urban notables, merchants, and craftsmen, became the medium of choice for the production and dissemination of painting and drawing. Now, even a craftsman could have his portrait sketched along with that of his wife by Moin Mosawwar, a student of Reza Abbasi that Sheila has so well worked through. This Moin drawing is part of a group of works that he draws for his friends. They are usually quick and spontaneous sketches. And this is very precisely here dated to Thursday night, the 15th of Muharram al-Haram, 1052, which is equivalent to the 15th of April, 1642. And here you have a really interesting addition saying that it was sketched in the alley of the horsehair weaver, Kucheye Astarbofan. Whether it's, again, I'm not sure, Sheila would probably be able to answer this question, whether horsehair was used for paintbrushes or no, or just cloth, but anyway, clearly from a craft circle. By the 17th century in Isfahan, another important transformation came about in the technology of bookmaking. A new demand for literary anthologies spread into the urban, notable, and merchant sector of Isfahani society. Collections of miscellaneous literary texts revealing the reading material of private collections of Isfahanis emerges. This increase in everyday manuscript and album production in 17th century in Isfahan indicates that the merchant class was engaging both in the economy of the book alongside the collecting of single-page illustrations. As Isfahanis came to read, write, collect, and reflect and discuss their readings, their distinctive subjectivities too came to be shaped by these new social and cultural practices. Just to give you an example here of one of these single-page paintings, a portrait of a man with a strange hat, which I've only seen usually women wearing, but in any case, a man holding a book and a painting which was clearly meant for an album that was dated by the help of Masume Farhad, my friend and colleague, to the 1560s and 1570s. Clearly, this work on friendship is a collaboration of friends as well. Another image that you see a little bit later, around 1600 to 1630, titled The Reader, a man reading clearly here, but also what I see as his clothes really forming a composite of collective characters from either the epics or Sufi poetry that he was reading. And this is by Muhammad Sharif Musawwar. Okay. Part 2, the social contours of friendship, from text to praxis. In early modern Isfahan, album owners engaged in the practice of assembling and preserving fragments of texts ranging from treatises on etiquette, ethics, friendship letters, model letters, marriage contracts, wills, travelogues, and religious and political tracts. There are thousands of albums from the 17th century Safavi Iran, each distinct from one another. They all, however, bear important documentary information, such as the date, the location of assembly, and at times even the name of the scribes and the owners. The majmu'ahs can be understood as portable libraries, representing the literary repertoires of educated Isfahanis and their literacies, reading tastes, and sensibilities in a pre-print culture. Majmu'ahs enjoyed wide circulation in Isfahan, enlivening for us communities of learning which shared particular bodies of subjective knowledge transmitted via different ownership. Since various owners' signs, including personal seals, names, dates, and marginalia that comments upon or interprets the text, mark many of these albums, historians are able to explore social and cultural change through the lens of a new type of collecting and reading. This is the first page of one of the majmu'ahs at Tehran University Library, a majmu'ah that has a rare, usually not, ما في هذا المجموعة, a rare table of contents that usually one has to just go through and figure out what has been pieced together and assembled together in this majmu'ah. And from here you can actually see that it's you have books of divination by Jafar, by Ali, several Sufi treatises by the famous Sufi Nur Bakhsh, a poem by Vahshi of Khosrow and Shirin, essays on love, on dream interpretation, on the benefits of rose water, a real variety of texts, scraps. And here you have a date of the recording of this book, Tarikh Kitabat in Kitab, 1083, that corresponds to 1672, and a completion date of 1675, so it took 3 years to complete this majmu'ah. But you also have different evidences of ownership and personal fragments that appear in the margins of this front page. A line of poetry, for instance, lamenting the loss of a dear mother, dated the end of Ramadan, 1757, marking the Eid al-Fitr. Another kind of self-inscription one finds in the margins here by the owner, probably, or one of the owners, saying, "I am testing the ink." Interesting for my work on friendship and literacy, there is some lines of poetry on friendship from Sa'di's Golestan itself, reading, "Do not consider as friends as a friend the one who knocks on the door of prosperity, ni'mat, the one who feigns friendship or sworn brotherhood, barodar khandegi," which I'll be coming back to. The friend is the one who takes the hand of a friend in distress and in agony. Now, this may be a line of poetry that at some point was or marked a gift from one friend to another. Europeanists have long pointed out the link between the proliferation of personal narratives with the increased privatization of writing and reading in the early modern period. It has been argued that especially after the advent of the printing press, people began to read and write in solitude, of course alongside the ritual, the communal ritual of reading. In the fashionable Paris houses of the 18th century, for instance, the cabinet served as a place of retreat in which to work, to converse privately, or to keep papers, books, hang pictures, or other precious things. It was also a private place where women and men wrote personal letters in which confidential matters were entrusted to paper, destined to a friend, key practices through which elite Parisians are to have developed their interiority. I have been arguing here that cultural and social practices of reading, writing, painting, and collecting in early modern Iran did provide a space for the production and display of the self, even before print culture. I also contend that the episteme of Sufism shaped the everyday lives of Isfahanis, providing the believer with an inner batin consciousness as distinct from the outer zahir, performance of the self. Sufi practices and of seclusion, for instance, khalwat, and sohbat, conversation and companionship, were conducive to self-awareness and reflection. Moreover, sworn friendships, the everyday relational experiences that put to test a set of ethics and behaviors, were essential to the practice of Sufism and to the constitution of the self. I have discovered numerous texts of vows of brotherhood, sighe ukhuwat, and vows of sisterhood, sighe khaharkhondegi, in 17th century albums from Isfahan. The vows language situated participants in a shared spiritual communitas, often represented in Sufi and chivalry futawat manuals, circulated within craft and artisan circles. These friendships entailed partnerships in this world and the hereafter between two brothers or sisters who pledged themselves to one another for the sake of God. In the context of Shi'i law and practice, sighe designates temporary marriages. The analogous term aqd, knotting or joining, used interchangeably in some chivalric manuals to specify the ritual of mystic friendships, is a legal term applied for literal marriages. Both sighe and aqd involve contractual agreement and public oaths of obligation and promise. Collected alongside other legal records of formalized practices such as sales, wills, and as well as temporary and permanent marriages, copies of these vows of brotherhood and sisterhood have been preserved in albums most likely belonging to magistrates, to qazis. They are testimony to the legal and formal social practice of surrogate brotherhood and sisterhood in Isfahan. Here you have what I see as precisely this sighe ukhuwat, because they're in the rituals and the description itself of the content of the sighe. Clearly, the handshake is a very, very important aspect of formalizing the gesture, the ritual of brotherhood. Female friendships, and I'm going to talk a little bit about an Isfahani widow. To provide you with a sense of the texture of these friendships, let me turn to the writing of a widow from Isfahan, a product of the spread of literacy in early modern Isfahan. I have elsewhere written about the widow, born into the Urdubadi family of bureaucrats in Isfahan, whose poem narrating her pilgrimage to Mecca I stumbled upon in one of these albums belonging to her family. I have yet to encounter a woman, whether elite or non, writing her own experiences in 17th century Isfahan. Her distinctive voice reveals how the practice of writing allowed for the articulation of a gendered subjectivity, a woman as a woman, a wife, a mother, a Sufi, a lover, and a friend. In her poem, she writes about her husband, who has just passed away, and her female friend, who she visits impulsively during her travels, referring to both as her intimate companions, Yoro Rafiq. The widow was born into a privileged Urdubadi family of penmen, and according to the scribe's introduction to her poem, she was the widow of Mirza Khalil, the Raqam Navis of the Divan, one who penned royal decrees for the last Safavi Shah, Shah Sultan Hussein. It is certainly due to her family's socio-political status that the Isfahani widow could perform the Hajj, which was an expensive and dangerous venture in her days. The Urdubadi family scribe introduces the author as the Bilqis and Khadija of the age, Bilqis Avani, Khadija Dorani, praising and comparing the widow with the two wise and powerful female figures, the Prophet's first wife, herself a widow, and the Queen of Sheba. The scribe includes her long poem, 1,200 verses, in an album of letters, decrees, poems, and essays he transcribed and compiled during his tenure at her family home. Hoping to replenish the void created by her husband's death, the widow sets off on her pilgrimage to Mecca from Isfahan, the capital of the Safavi Empire. It is around the end of the 17th century. This Isfahani widow's choice to cure her melancholy through the writing of a mystical journey towards God reveals how piety and life experiences kindled her desire to write her narrative. Since the wiles of fortune, charche hile pardoz, left my heart burning with sorrow due to the absence, Firaq, of my intimate companion, Yar, I vowed to circumambulate the holy Kaaba. She continues, I tied myself around the holy Kaaba, perhaps turning her bodily self into a vow. She tells of her sleepless nights and tormented days. I saw no solution other than travel, Siyohat. The language she employs is mystical, and in fact, its poetic form, the Masnavi, is the privileged medium of Sufi expression and the preferred choice of her favorite medieval poet, Nizami. Travel and circumambulation are the central themes of writing and healing that mark the tone of the widow's poem. In the process of grieving, the Isfahani widow divulges her love for a female companion, Yar, from the past. En route to Damascus, where she was to join the Ottoman caravans headed for Mecca, she makes a detour. Perhaps in a passionate moment, feeling freed of her husband and liberated through her journey, she narrates her travels north to the Caucasus to visit her old friend. With the stories unfolding, it becomes clear that their separation had been forced due to rumors in circulation about the two women long ago when they were both still residents in Isfahan. She describes her old friend with the very terms of endearment meant for her husband and for God, Yar o Rafiq. The language of love the Isfahani widow uses to describe her female friend places her within this semantic field of mysticism. Though Persian mystical poetry was a male-centered domain whose object of desire was conventionally configured male and young, there was room for ambiguity between masculine and feminine, and human and divine. It was possible for reading audiences to imagine the beloved as a male or a female because Persian is a gendered neutral language, and the aesthetics of Sufism drew the beloved with beauty marks that did not distinguish one particular gender from another. To declare the love she feels for every one of her companions, her deceased husband, her surrogate sister, and God, the widow appropriates the poetic form of the Masnavi. Consistent with the genre, she describes her religious experience and the reawakening of her friendship with Sufi idioms of absence and longing. As narrator, the widow exposes a feminine space in Isfahani society that was established through the ritual of sisterhood or companionship, which made use of religious connotations and the language of mysticism to express female love and friendship. The freedom awarded by travel, specifically by the experience of pilgrimage, allowed for a temporary rearrangement of disciplinary spaces. Writing, like travel, allowed our subject to move across foreign lands, to produce a certain kind of knowledge about herself in relations to other human subjects at different stages of the journey. Writing and travel helped her form a subjectivity. It allowed the widow to think about the personal dilemmas she faced and to develop her thoughts and articulate an individual self. Here is a figure of perhaps a female in a similar situation. It's a signed single-page painting, again from the 1640s or early 50s by Muhammad Qasim, signed the work of the humble, lowly Muhammad Qasim, where you have clearly this trope, which will be reappearing, of, in most cases, a male lover contemplating his beloved in a jug of wine. And in this case, because we do have actual details about and descriptions about this vows of sisterhood, these necklaces are exchanged. And if you look closer, I don't know if you see it, there is a necklace as well around the neck of the female friend. I'd like to move at the very end to friendship letters. Friendship letters surface in the 17th century literary albums as a distinct type of correspondence copied, collected, and transmitted over several generations in Isfahan. 17th century scribes authors and owners of albums categorized this epistolary genre as the rasail ikhwaniyat, or fraternal letters. And they're mainly male as far as I've seen till now. Fraternal letters are model letters of friendship that performed a set of conventions and protocols resembling the practices that governed sworn friendships between male members of craft circles and of mystical communities, who were in spirit married to one another as brothers. Earlier expressions of male friendship in the 16th century, once verbalized through ghazal, love poetry, began in the 17th century to be performed in the form of prose letters and fraternal letters. The expression was not so different, for the prominent epistolary theme of the absent friend also evoked the mystical trope of separation from the beloved, so well explored in ghazal poetry. Many of the letters employed tropes of longing for the beloved and held traces of the homoerotic language of ghazal poetry, widely used and circulated only a generation earlier among friends. In fact, ghazal poetry and epistolary texts were part of the same economy of manuscript transmission. Unlike letters, ghazals were recited orally as well as read by owners of the albums. Reflecting anxieties around the vicissitudes of friendship in early modern Isfahan, model letters contained requests to meet with friends, chides of negligence, and forgiveness for disloyal behavior. In personal letters, one is impressed by the author's self-conscious epistolary presentation in the absence of his friend's body. Currently, I'm reading albums of familiar letters to determine how both the absent and missing body, as well as the face-to-face encounter, become represented in the disembodied letter. Familiar letters textualized and texturized gazes and the loving emotions that they emanated. They deployed the poetic language of the ghazal to conjure the beloved, evoking, for example, the absent one's braids, the arrow-shaped eyebrows, or the black facial mole. Epistolary representations in these letters were stylized performances of emotions meant as ciphers for particular kinds of desires restricted by a new civilizing code of conduct. The 17th century culture of epistolarity in Isfahan allows the historian entry into the social elite's dynamics of knowledge and affect, where speech, gestures, and gazes were written into the letter, and where the oral and the written fused to shape an alternative mode of communication and form for expressing the emergent self. Traces of the complex contemporaneous meanings of intimacy reside in familiar letters, whose location I have tried to develop here for you at the intersection of the histories of friendship, literacy, reading, and collecting. Let me just end with our last image. A male figure reading a letter or a poem to or from the beloved. Again, the beloved appearing painted in a cushion. And art historians have associated the painting with the drawing styles of Afzal al-Husseini between 1640 and 1650. He was a close follower of Reza Abbasi again, and his later style, and repeated several of his subject matters. Again, the topos of including the image of the beloved on a cushion or a wine bottle is one that has been introduced by Reza Abbasi and has been worked on by Sheila Camby in her study on the rebellious reformer. The popularity of depicting in these single-page paintings, for one, single figures, and I think that's very new as a genre in these single-page paintings, but also a singular male friend reading a poem or a letter rather than two friends in conversation or with a handshake, as I showed you, speaks not only of a stylistic topos, but of a social and cultural transformation in the practice of friendship and love. In the absence of the beloved friend, reading, conversing with a beloved, reciting poetry together is by the 17th century represented as a private act. These transformations are also part of a moral campaign and political control effected by Shi'i jurists, together with their patrons, the Safavid kings, to assert the law and rule of the Sharia, to sanction heterosexual marriage, and to affect heteronormative subjects whose economical and sexual production would further state interests. The early modernity of Isfahan, then, has to be understood not only as a history of the changing nature of the state and its control of literacy, but also of the changing nature of the self, as expressed in the literate and prosaic self. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Kathryn. That was really brilliant and fascinating, and it marries our literary and artistic side so beautifully. Before Kathryn takes some questions, I would like to say two things. First, I would like to say that Michelle Ridgely has is going to be outside when you leave, and if any people would like to be on a mailing list for future lectures of this type, please just give her your name and you'll be sent notices. Secondly, and very importantly, I would like to thank Yolanta Shashati and her family trust for making this possible. We're so grateful to all of the donors to the museum, but particularly in my department, we are grateful to those who support our activities, and we really do appreciate that.